The tavern was by no means hospitable. A place that likely only ever saw the regular visit of its locals. The furnishing was simple and even lacking in places, crudely fleshed out with rickety tables that occasionally had barrels masquerading as such. At first glance, there seemed to be not a single pair of matching stools or chairs. Maria recognized their trio to be viewed as quite the rare occurrence. Herself and German in their imposing attire, and Lawrence at her side, dressed fancily and properly, judging from the looks that glared through the ill-lit interior. "Here!" Millard called out as he stood from his table and walked towards them. "It's best we take this outside." He turned them around to exit the tense environment. "Boy, this story is turning out to be true in all the wrong ways." While his mouth managed to squeeze out a light smile, his eyebrows was turned in worry. "Were there not two of you?" German remarked sternly at the absence of the companion he had originally been sent with. "Well, he decided to leave early. You might have..." He swallowed his words as he caught sight of Carol, and grave concern struck him. "Oh, you brought Carol?" Maria was instantly worried that the situation might indeed be more dangerous than she initially thought. "Tell us what you found, Millard." He made a quick inspection of the crew they had arrived with. The concern receded a bit, seeing how the number of protectors outmatched that of the scholars. He made his way over to lean up against the wall of the tavern exterior. "After we had purchased a room for the night," he pointed with his thumb back towards the building, "we started asking around to see what everybody knew. Nothing new to us as it was. Hadn't seen him in months, never been there since. Everybody knows to stay away. It's that simple." A short pause was made, and a wandering glance was cast over at their company. "So, we decided to just go and see for ourselves, with nothing new and all. We scouted out the place that whole evening, before returning late at night. Nothing too strange really happened, besides the place having a... Well, I can't really put it into words. It's just strange being up close. Then we heard what I would say be similar to chanting-like sounds. Nothing like how a human sounds, though." He stood abruptly straight from the wall and started pacing in front of them. "We did, however, return earlier than we had planned. We felt watched. Animals you can disregard. But it could not be animals. Something moved in the forest all around us. And there were many who moved as calculating as a human." A shudder flew through him just then. "The next day, we headed back, a bit more encouraged. I mean, we never saw the things in the forest, so we could not really... Anyway, we hoped that there would be a chance to enter. It did appear peaceful, though terribly eerie. Quicker than we thought, we did manage to encounter someone from there. When the both of us walked out from the forest, into the field that lies between the forest and the hamlet, someone came to meet us." He stopped in his tracks and shook his head slowly. He, I don't know, was wrapped in cloth. I could not see the whole of it, but it was not like us. It was tall. The skin was bluish and the head, I mean, I did not see it, but it must have been huge under there. Did it speak? Lawrence quickly and somewhat rudely asked. It did speak. Very strangely. It knew who we were and what we sought. It wasn't for us, and that we do best to leave. At first, despite it all, he did seem reasonable to a degree. So I told him that I just wanted to know, but he waved me away and turned back. They knew you were from Bergenworth? No, he did not say specifically, just that he knew about us. Caelid came up to their side. Noticing his expression, she took position by his side, hugging his right hand. The whole hamlet is cursed. I know it. When that man spoke to me, it was like his voice was in my head. Is there any possibility that we could converse with them? Lawrence wondered. I don't know. They seemed reluctant, at best, to do any sort of cooperation. They walked back to one of the carriages that had taken them there all the way from Bergenworth. We are prepared for the worst. Lawrence shammily slammed his hand on the carriage. The provost accounted for hostility. What? Did this become a rescue effort? Millard retorted with a sneer on his face. Lawrence noticeably turned pensive, shaking his head and smiling widely. No, nothing like that. But better safe than sorry, right? Good thing they seem reasonable. I'm certain we will reach an understanding. Don't you fret. None appeared to share his conviction, which unfortunately made him appear rather naive. Millard began mounting the coach box and reached out a hand to aid Caelid up as well. Is there a way to the hamlet that our carriages can travel? Lawrence looked up to them. There is a road, but several trees have fallen over it further down. We would have to leave on foot at that point, but it's not far from there. Lawrence laid his hand to rest at his sides, thinking to himself. After a moment of thought, his conclusion came. Very well. Not many other options. Let's be off. Everyone scattered about to different carriages and made general checks of order. Maria grabbed German and hastily followed Lawrence inside the carriage. She forcefully closed the door behind her to assure of their solitude. It had bothered her since departure that Lawrence had been taken aside by Willem for an exchange of words. They did so quite secretively, and upon inquiry, he had briskly played her off. His recent display made the curiosity overwhelm her, and she was now determined for the truth. The carriage began slowly on its travel. The wheels was felt faintly moving over the dirt road, with the sounds of the horses journeying onwards. Lawrence, she addressed him like a parent would when scolding their child. Tell me. He looked puzzled at her, but knowingly. Come on, I asked you before. What is it about? All right. Yes. You should have known before we set off. But Willem told me in confidence and... He paused. I'm torn about what he wants us to do. I don't like it one bit. He said so while looking genuinely disgusted, to which German leaned forward in the bumping carriage. What did he say, Lawrence? Lately, he has been fixed with the idea that eyes would have some meaning. And then I mean real eyes. Supposedly he had that revelation in a dream or something the like. Utterly baseless, I say. His own proclamation of the Great One's alien nature is affecting him badly, almost making him delusional. He thinks we might be able to confirm this theory of his. Once again he paused, collecting himself. It was clear that he was in direct opposition with Willem's methods. His head sank lower down and he shook it. A hand hesitantly moved to awkwardly scratch his hair, but froze in emotion, eventually deciding against it. He believes that they, the Great Ones, can be perceived. Oh, it's so perceived. He leaned back, breathing in heavily and bumping his head against the back of his seat. He was so convinced that these people were capable of doing so. He has gotten so irrational lately, having these outlandish ideas that he maniacally obsesses over. They only grow worse and worse. Face up into the carriage roof, he grew more furious in his argument. Lawrence, please. What did he ask of you? German snapped, and he jolted where he sat, focusing on him. He rubbed his eyes, once more lurching into his slouched pose. Sorry. Yes. He told that if the people had indeed undergone a metamorphosis of any kind, he wanted samples. Specifically their eyes and their brains. Maria's mouth flung open. She looked to German, who stared with down-turned brows at Lawrence. What? His voice was soft and cold, eyes deadly focused on his friend. And how did he suggest we acquire those things? Maria added, more flustered in her tone. Lawrence had his face buried in his hands. When he turned up and sat straight, he did not meet their eyes. I don't know. I know little of what he wants these days. He likely did not consider they must be plucked from someone's head for him to research. He became gradually flustered once more. I can't believe it. It sounds so unlike him, she said to no one in particular. It was more a statement for herself. Have you not noticed him? He acts more strange and at times appears like a pure madman in his requests. This does it, though. And all because... what? He believes they see invisible entities. Lawrence shrugged dramatically with an overdone, baffled face. I don't know. That's what he told me. But it carries little reason. And do you think he listens when I point out the absurdity? He probably doesn't listen to what anyone says. Granted, if the accounts are true of transformation, that in itself is fascinating. But to jump at the conclusion like it does... He shook his head so fervently he appeared to have been caught stuck in the motion. Has he gone mad for real this time? German could barely keep his voice down. That's why I preferred not to tell. What do you say to such things? I mean, has he really gone mad? To a degree, he was right. Maria almost felt the beguiling magnificence of the provost shatter in her mind. She was not blind, but could only now mark the incident as the product of something more ruling, that the possibility of the provost's faculties may prove faulty, sooner or later. He composed himself with a deep breath. She still found herself somewhat stunned as she recalled events when he had appeared strange, now attributed to some unknown mania. As I said, I am confident we can get to the bottom of this without resorting to the slaughter of some whalers. If they carry knowledge of greatness, I can convince them to share it. I must. He slowly eased into a considerably more calm and satisfied state, that of what he promoted before. Almost like this was, despite the horrid insinuation on the home front, a very exciting expedition to him. Unease swarmed the carriage. Both Maria and German bumped into the backrest and exhaled strained. While Lawrence looked out of the window with the interest of a tourist, she could not banish Willem from her thoughts. For years he had remained the same man. Or was her memory tricking her, and had a slow and hidden transformation occurred during this time? No solution would come to her due to the shocking state her mind and thoughts had been dominated by. German, too, did seem to share her woe. She had always had such admiration for the provost, with all his answers to all of her questions. Did he still have those answers? Was it still the truth he sought after? Most dangerous and damning to her was the worries beginning to manifest of exactly how long this proclaimed madness had reigned. How clever can ideals be if conceived by a crazed mind? The driver halted the horses, signaling their arrival with the sound of hoofs stomping in the dirt. Vitus opened the door to their carriage. Now we walk. The forest around them was peaceful. Birds sang in the trees and critters ran about in the brush. The sun lay at its zenith, so its rays shone through the leaves upon them. From the carriage in front of them emerged Luna and two protectors. As soon as she planted her feet on the ground, her head snapped towards Lawrence, as if she could supernaturally sense exactly where he was.
Now what? There are heaps of equipment.
Just bring that you absolutely can't be without, he called back. We likely won't need it all. He walked over to join her, so as to not further share their loud conversation with the entire forest. This is a peaceful exchange of knowledge. They could very well be thrilled to have more folks wanting to share and understand their point of view. If not, diplomacy is our best tool. Maria glanced over at German next to her, who met her eyes with a similar concerned expression. There was hope in Lawrence, and a plain denial made somewhat excusable by his recent account. Whatever your job is, German spoke up. Ours is to be prepared for any threat.
So we will gladly haul as many necessities as it takes to keep us safe,
Maria finished. The expression Luna gave Lawrence would indicate she agreed with them, but he turned around to object. He stretched out his arms as if their opinion was thrown at him at full force, and he desperately tried to stop it. "Come now, you. It is not rather peaceful to appear at one's doorstep armed to the teeth. Try to keep it simple, to reinforce our good intentions." Once more they exchanged glances, with the same message. "Arm your person," German declared to the gathering. "Some of us will just have to stay behind, for appearance's sake. 2 of you stay here with the carriages." Lawrence approached him and spoke gently. "We don't know yet, German. Rumors say many things, and hostility is not as certain." "You are right. We don't know." Each of the protectors loaded up with their armaments, packing some additional emergency utilities. The scholars, being the trio of Caelid, Luna and Lawrence, accompanied by 2 history students, Abril and Lorraine, and 1 biologist master, Clark. They each packed light, or rather as light as they could, managing to amass their backpacks in the size of one more fit for a long hike. As per German's orders, 2 of 11 protectors remained stationary along the vehicles as the group slowly began moving past the fallen trees. It appeared simply as a disused road from first glance at the vegetative obstacles, but the road itself was still freshly trampled. The trees, having fallen naturally as it would show, still had some design to their positionings. As they got further and further in, it began feeling like the forest was changing around them. The sun seemed to shine less brightly, despite it keeping the same position as before. Maria peeked around at the others, plainly detecting the same suspicion on their faces, a feeling of unease. It could very well be the wild-grown nature of the forest, and that simply the crowns of the leaves were dense enough to cast ample shade, but still, her instincts were more alert than they ought to be simply from environment. It could have come across as naive or out of place, but this was the most significant fact about it. Granted that there had been some initial impressions that could contribute to her state of mind, but the feeling was too raw, too noticeable for a peaceful forest. Thus it dominated her mind, and was the sole thing swirling inside her skull. The experience had her wondering if this is what Carol felt when hearing those utterances of hers. Suddenly the road came to an abrupt end, like a wall of forest had been raised and directly cut off the path forward. In front of them, it seemed like the trees and bushes had grown forever, a natural end to a useless road. Each head turned to Millard for answers. He looked expressionlessly at the questioning group and proceeded to nod his head indicatively and walked straight forward, amongst their still figures, through the abrupt growing bushes. "It's not far now, just past this thicket." They carefully navigated around the lush greenery, low trees and closely growing vegetation. Maria could swear she heard a large rustling deeper in the forest, where her eyes could not see. Sounds just too conspicuous to give someone pause, but still just sounds in a forest. Millard's statement proved right, and soon they were upon the edge of the forest that opened up into a field. That fearful feeling reached its climax as they stood at the forest's edge, staring at the decrepit fishing hamlet. If the place still was inhabited, then they must be very preoccupied to allow their houses to fall into such poor conditions. The settlement must have suffered from poor construction in its very beginning, as what lay before them was more akin to the discarded materials of a more successful build. One could only see the first line of houses as a fog lay over the town and crept towards them out in the field. On its left towered the beginning of a cliff that stretched far beyond, deep into the grey obscurity. They collectively allowed a moment to prepare themselves for whatever was to come. Lawrence was the one to take the first steps. Gelmir shot out an arm and stopped him. He was given a stern look which made his posture tense, and Gelmir began walking slightly in front of him. The remaining scholars stood behind as more protectors joined the two. Brave as she had become, Caelid did not release Millard's hand and was poised by his side as he closely followed Gelmir. Maria slowly started to walk behind the group, before making a gesture for the 5 remaining protectors to stay put. When their advancing team had made it but a few paces closer, a group emerged from within the fog, out from the haphazard cottages. Several cloth-wrapped fishers, some walking supported by long whaler hooks. They came out to meet them in a civil manner, much to Lawrence's pleasure, and he quickened his pace, much to Gelmir's displeasure. The hamlet fishers made halt, allowing the Bergenworth envoys a bit more ground to cover to reach them. The two groups stood silent, examining each other. The villagers all seemed to be hunched over, all covering some deformities under those long hanging garbs. Their bodies all seemed grossly malformed, judging by the outlandish silhouette made by their garbs. A head could appear to sit atop an incredibly long neck. One appeared stiff as a walking stick, but with a large sheet of cloth, who could tell what lay under? Maria had to brace herself as she saw that their bare feet had fins and barnacle growths on them.
"Weren't you warned?"
one of them said in a dark voice with a gurgling undertone. His face was completely covered to the point of blindness. Lawrence took a deep breath. "We have come from Bergenworth, the foremost academy of learning there is. Perhaps you heard of us?" The whalers gave no answer. They stood dumbly as they did before. "We have come seeking to partake in your wisdom. There are many others seeking answers in this world, and perhaps it is so you possess answers." The spokesman turned his hooded head slowly back at the party behind him, but he quickly directed his attention back to Lawrence.
"You keep coming. If this knowledge had been meant for you, it would have shown itself to you. You will not find what you seek here. It is not ours to give.
In between sentences, the man would inhale in a strained and gurgling manner. Then, good sir, would you perhaps tell me how it came to you? The man stood like petrified to the delicately asked question for a long while before answering. Trying to perceive his thinking was near impossible due to how inhumanly still he stood and due to his obscured form.
She came from the sea to us. That is all there is to say. Now you must leave.
They began to turn around and walk back into their hamlet, rendering Lawrence speechless from disappointment. But Millard abruptly stepped out next to him. "It's the mother!" he shouted after them. "You mentioned her before. Can she give us what we seek?" Lawrence's head snapped his direction, astonished, much like the rest. The fishers stopped dead in their tracks. All turned towards them once more.
You...
One of them hissed. He released Carol's hand that he had been holding. His motion away from her caused her to gasp quietly. Lawrence whispered something as Millard passed him, but Maria could not hear. Despite the distance between them, she could almost feel the anxiety emanating from German's person. The fishers were quite larger than they appeared. Their hunched form made them look small, but right in front of Millard, their heads met eye level.
The mother... You...
Is it the mother that can give us what she gave you? They seemed almost in awe at him for uttering the words.
Yes. You are right. It came to you as well.
But then his tone changed from a gentle whisper into an angered accusation.
And you brought those that do not know, those that do not understand, and never will, that may harm her child.
A wailing pike shot out from the little gathering and found Millard's stomach. They saw the tip emerge bloody out from his back. He gave out a short, surprised stutter. The hook twisted around and he groaned, louder and louder until he was screaming. The one holding the hook then lifted him from the ground with incredible strength and haste, planting it firm in the dirt. Several things happened all around Maria during the upheaval of her ward. Carol wordlessly collapsed, so she had to step forth and catch her. Lawrence's legs visibly crumpled, and he fell to his knees. A young protector leapt over to shield Lawrence as he hit the ground and began dragging his paralyzed body back, away from danger. German slammed his blade into the hilt, disappeared in a cloud, and emerged closer where Millard's massacred form hung limp. The group of villainous fishers had immediately begun to retreat back to the village, much quicker and in a more feral manner than one initially would think. Maria laid Carol down in the grass and heard the footsteps behind her. The other protectors ran after German. He had clumsily tilted the pike over, holding the limp body and guiding it onto the ground. Cromley ran straight past after the villagers, hollering accusations and obscenities. From the fog came a roar that drowned every other sound. She saw Cromley stop where he was, and a monstrous, bulbous man-beast emerged from the grey beyond. Tall as the cottages, it slammed down with what appeared to be an anchor at Cromley, who dodged backwards. Other protectors close to German ran for his aid. The beast then flung the anchor after the smaller man. Too late, they all saw their companion get hit and crushed by the mass of rusted iron tossed after him. He was practically buried under its weight. Maria jolted and meekly uttered a pained squeak. The protector stopped in horror, and the monster waved its fists and roared at them before turning its barnacle-clad back to head into the hamlet. The second of silence that followed the beast's disappearance was made longer by the void left in her head. What eventually dragged her back to consciousness was the empowering, emotional outburst of German. In pain and misery, he stood up from Millard's body and let his sorrow be heard in a terrifying scream that echoed over the silent field. Loud, sudden, short and filled with primal force. Like a fiend, no longer human, he flew after them into the hamlet. The rest became enraged by their master's roar and took after him, equally maniacal. The protectors around her left as well to have their sweet vengeance. Luna made Lawrence stand and limped back with him. Clark heaved up Carol from her lap, sweaty and red from fear, and began to make clear of the situation. Maria was left with a choice. Seeing Millard on the ground, the anchor still planted in the earth, thinking of poor Carol, a fiery bloodlust boiled up in her. Something she knew well of and did not want, but then there also was a part of her being that yearned for blood, the beast's blood. She flew after her companions into the hamlet. The sounds growing did not sway her, not even terrify her. Not now when something foreign to her consciousness dominated her. Steel blades cut through flesh. Broken voices roared inhumanly. The swinging sound of garbs flowing as the protectors jumped to and fro. Blood spilling. She ducked out of instinctual reflex from a deafening roar. The bloodied bodies of the horrifying wailers left the trail to where the fight was happening. Bodies not of men, not anymore, but of hideous and savage deformations. Monstrous fissures emerged from their homes to attack German and the others while they ruthlessly combated strange beings. Had it not been for the primal force that had taken hold of her, fear would surely have done so now. Barnacle growths would dominate their whole heads. Some had the same feature, but had grown as several small holes upon their limbs. in a way. They all appeared weakened and harmless from their forms, as if ailed greatly by their malformations. Luckily for her, a vile desire kept her sanity shielded from the sight. She separated her Akuyo. The one responsible for the roar appeared to be an enlarged fish man, with a round and shiny head and a mouth so large there was no room for eyes or nose. No communication transpired between her peers. Everything was just a nightmarish slaughter. One of the large brutes grabbed hold of a protector and picked him up from his feet. It began to devour him whole. German moved in with 2 quick slices of the blade to the creature's feet, bringing the feasting giant to its knees. He then leapt up to stand on its shoulders, transformed the blade and aimed a precise cut to its throat. The thickness of the monster kept the head from separating, but not from death's clutches. Maria was rushed by a frenzied wailer, flinging its bare hands at her, and cried out in anger and hatred. She cut at its hands and sliced one clean off. The only thing the creatures got in their favor was resilience and strength, much like the Thumeru Guardians. But also like them, were easily countered by the Protector's abilities. In its derangement, it hurled itself towards her, to which she could easily step out of the way and plunge the 2 blades clean through the creature's torso from the back. She lost track of the others and could only seem to focus on the walking horrors. Before, she heard the grief-stricken voices of her peers. Now everything seemed part of the same sound, a frenzied cacophony. More emerged with crude weaponry in the shape of various fishing tools. She sliced with a short blade towards the nearest fiend and cut open its skin, finishing at its throat. As the streak of blood sprayed out from the wound, its hood fell back to reveal the horrifying deformed crossing between a fish and a man's face. One eye yet normal, the other bulging from its socket, glossy and dead. Everything was just like a dream. The sight and the horrible feeling suppressed by something more older and primal, causing her to feel like someone else, like it was someone else's nightmare. She suddenly became aware of a pain in her side. A large wound had been made. When she had suffered it was not known to her. She never felt the pain of impact. The Canehurst blood flowed from her. She felt at it, surprised at its existence. It made her stumble, clumsily dodging a swing coming from another of the aberrations. The rake wielded as a spear was suddenly blown away by the silver streak, following the incredible speed of the burial blade. German stepped in between them and cleaved the head off the beast. Afterwards he turned directly towards her and reached out a hand. Being stunned by adrenaline, confusion of combat, and a growing pain, she was unable to mouth the proper words when she, but not him, saw another of them approaching from his back. A mouth opened from the head covered completely by hard sea growths. Arms clutched forcefully around German's torso, and several rows of teeth from an abnormal maw sank down into his shoulder. He gritted his teeth and did not scream. Everything was slowed, as what had begun to transpire in reality occurred within seconds, perhaps even less. Seeing German struggle, the pain did no longer make her weak. The shift in sensation was so rapid, it felt like the blood in her wound had been set ablaze. She could not remember why she had not used it before. At the moment, she seemed only to recall its vile and corrupting power, very fitting for slaying fiends. Provoked by ancient instinct, she dragged the short blade across her side, smearing the blood along the edge. The same blood drawn by her father and his father. The blood they all had used to destroy their enemies. And perhaps it was justly done, if their enemies had indeed paralleled the things gathered around her now. The blood along the edge flared up into red fire, and she pierced it forward into the aquatic skull of the vile attacker. The maw opened and German tumbled forward and past her. Fire erupted from the beast's mouth, like it was spewing flame down onto the ground, while she held her arm firmly forward with the dagger plunged into the head. Its entire body was locked in convulsion, and she was captivated by its agony. She removed the dagger from the carcass and similarly smeared the long blade of the Rakuyo along the same blood-stained wound. She turned with a mighty horizontal cut that sent the violent crimson flares forth in a wide arc, singeing the bodies of the monsters. They reeled and writhed as she jumped forward, lunging for one of the distant colossus that raged on. It was like throwing part of her being forward, seeing how the flames shot out from the tip of her blade to feast upon the form of the man-beast. It grew frightened and she continued to swing and slice with the blood of Cainhurst, creating devastating enhancements to each attack. Her hand grew crimson red and small, thinly cuts made the blood flow onto the Rakuyo. She could feel how life went with it, but not enough to weaken her. The exchange was well worth it. She could impossibly stop now. Somehow, while she was watching the blood flow from her fingers, the beast had fallen and lay dead. She looked around, through the haze as exhaustion came upon her, as suddenly as it all had started. Pain was soon to follow, and she collapsed. When dark was all that she saw, she thought that perhaps it had been a terrible dream after all. Opening her eyes, the illusion persisted as she saw the grey clouded sky. Scarce drops of rain fell unseemingly and turned everything damp. Her head rested on German's lap. She saw the downside of his chin as he looked forward distantly. The air seemed to escape her lungs when she turned to look his way, at a very real nightmare spectacle that was the fishing hamlet. Now deprived of the sweet call of vengeance, unfathomable regret flooded her mind. Only a faint high-pitched tone could be heard from somewhere, coming and going. He disregarded her awakening until she moved, trying to sit up. He laid a hand on her chest, pushing her gently back as she were. Her slight movement made her side explode with pain. The power of Cainhurst. Quite something, he said fleetingly, trying to meet her eyes with a forced smile. Seeing his eyes made her chest feel like it would collapse in on itself, and from up her throat came a teary sob. Always the one to think of others before himself, even while the pain was clearly visible in his eyes. She looked out at the massacre. He sat straight against the wall of a hut in a small square where the narrow streets converged. The hamlet was built with little planning, and houses stood haphazardly, creating varying-sized streets. In the plaza's middle rested a quaint water well. Abhorrent carcasses were strewn about on the ground, covered with patches of water. I should have been better than this. I thought, but I was wrong. His tone appeared as if he had forgotten her presence.
Where is everyone?
He gave a resigned sigh. It's my fault. My weakness. They felt they needed to finish what I started. It's probably them you can hear now. I could not stop any of them once they had begun. He paused and continued to have his attention focused on nothing. Carol ran after she saw you. A distant sound began to distinguish itself, growing in volume and definition. Luna's cries as she came stumbling towards them with tears running down her cheeks.
Thank the gods, you're awake. Oh, thank the gods, thank them, you live.
She began to sob as she fell, kneeling beside them in the damp dirt. She tried to collect herself, with poor results, but managed to at least be comprehensible through the snivelling.
German, you have to go to Lawrence. He's not well, and I can't talk to him.
Maria made another effort and was able to sit herself up and bit her lip to compose herself within the pain.
Where is he?
Luna looked to German, then at her and pointed towards a building.
He's...
Her sobs evolved into a mild weeping. Can you walk, Maria? She responded with a determined look and slung her arm around his shoulder. He nodded and slowly stood up with her. Together they limped towards the little house, Luna in tow. As a small village for fishers, one saw what one expected to see. Nets hanging on the walls, fishing rods leaned against the houses. But everything appeared horribly neglected. The townsfolk must have abandoned their trade for their mad reasons. Something must have indeed occupied their minds, as even the simplest of maintenance seemed to have escaped them. They began to hear a sloshing, gooey sound from inside the approaching house. Inside the decrepit and furniture-void space was Lawrence, kneeling over something with his back turned to them. German let go of her to begin approach, and she took stability by the doorframe. One of the mutilated whaler's body lie in front of him, the upper body obscured by his hunched position. "Lawrence." German spoke in a mild tone, but quickly grew silent.
"I told you I could do it. But it had to come to this. I told you wrong."
Lawrence muttered.
"But now I have to do the dirty work. At least Willem will be pleased."
German knelt down beside him.
"Lawrence, stop. There's nothing here."
The hair tied behind his head had become undone, and he sighed in an unexpected common manner and put down what he was doing.
"But there has to be something."
His voice broke, and his back started to shiver from the overwhelming emotions that suddenly overcame him.
"We can't leave like this. This can't be it. Somewhere."
"I know, Lawrence. But sometimes there are no answers. Or they are simply beyond our reach. But that is all right." German lay one arm around him, with only a slight tug to guide him away.
"But we already paid the price. They are dead. Our friends are dead. There must be something."
His voice could not hold up, and he started to cry. Luna came to him and helped him to his feet. He hugged her tightly and cried into her chest. She hugged back. Maria could then see what he had been doing. He had been searching the creature's head for eyes. Upon returning to the haunting plaza, they met the rest of the remaining 5 protectors, coming from the other direction. Their anger finally quenched by the blood of their foes, as their garb would indicate. Vitus in the front walked up to German like a shameful dog.
"You're lucky you did not see down under. And you should especially not see now."
He tried to pose himself as firm as his master, but managed not to do so when it meant facing him.
"What did you do, Vitus? How much more of your senses did you lose?"
German was grave and judgmental. Vitus let his head hang low.
"There is no one left."
German did not respond nor react. None had much to say despite the magnitude of their deed. One would imagine entire lectures could be held for the events, but much like her, they seemed to have lost their speech or will of it. What particularly disturbed Maria was something no other could imagine. Unlike them, she would forever pay a price, having tasted the vile blood art, a lingering burning that periodically now coursed through her body. But then again, she thought, would not everyone carry something with them for the rest of their lives? Something that would forever remind them that once upon a time they had forsaken reason and humanity. They had lost and given in to something that would remain with them forever. The enlightenment that what they had done on this day came from a place within them that had not just sprung out of nowhere, but had likely been there all along, and would continue to linger.
Have you seen Carol?
Vitus shook his head, clad with his large brim hat. Torn and wearily, German looked around. Without a word, he simply walked deeper into the hamlet. Without direction or any sense of presence, everyone silently followed. They each searched the corners of the defiled hamlet as they went for something as innocent as Carol. But no one took their search too far out of German's shadow. They came upon the large cliff wall the hamlet rested below, sheltered by it from furious seaward winds. For Maria, every step ached in pulses from the wound, but mostly did the pain spring from the memory of her own thoughts and deeds in the midst of bloody fire. She saw the pain carried within the others' footsteps as well, even in those lacking bodily wounds. When the base of the cliff was reached, no trace had been detected of their missing friend. Luna became more distraught as their search appeared to be at an end. She released the tight grip of Lauren's arm, who himself seemed devoid of concern or any emotion at all. With a weak, broken voice she called out Carol's name. It echoed up along the cliff and in between the small structures. Maria leaned against a pole holding some strange fisher lanterns, glowing blue.
Let's head back. Search the western part,
Vitus suggested to German over Luna's desperate hollering and the sound of the light rain. German stood still, watching carefully. The ground was muddy and wet, strewn with some long dead fish lying occasionally in the mud. Leaving Vitus where he stood, German followed his captured attention inside a building located up against the rock.
Come!
He shouted from inside. Inside was some sort of cargo lift. 4 sets of chains ran down a dark shaft, suspended to some contraption in the ceiling. The house interior had been carved into the cliff itself.
Here.
He pointed with his foot to a set of dragging footprints in the green algae-covered floor. Shoes of a familiar print.
The lift.
Once more German threw his glance down the shaft and around the room, eventually sighting a lever. With a decisive flip, it began to suspend upwards by some weighted mechanism. The round platform that was summoned could hold the entire group with little bother. It felt surreal descending deeper down, under the very ground the town stood upon, it seemed. But everything had been detached from reality, and the only thing, at least to Maria's own mind, that could bring some sense of stability was the whereabouts of their dear friend. The sound of the chains and the mechanism above grew fainter and fainter until everything became silent and dark. Stone began to reveal itself in the darkness, and the silence broke by a low thud of the elevator hitting rock floor. The cave that formed itself naturally out of the deep rock lay dark and narrow, but it was not frighteningly long as one saw shining light, promising the end of the damp darkness. The line where the sea met heaven was near bright white in color, with a light grey clouded sky. The sea itself was dark and calm. They had emerged on a secluded beach with rocky cliffs on both sides. There were two conspicuous things upon the view they saw. Maria's focus was captured by the first, Caelid, sitting just by the shoreline on a rock with her notebook drawn, looking out over the expanse. The other thing remained indistinct in nature to her, as she now had the sole intent on her friend. Having grown more accustomed to the pain, she made her way somewhat swiftly to her side. Her pace slowed as she grew closer and had the chance to take hurried glances at the motionless thing on the beach, lying where the land met sea, causing her to eventually stop entirely. It resembled a large jellyfish, but lacked the transparency and leaned more towards the bloated carcass of a baby whale. It was white as snow, be it its natural color or the result of the absence of life was undetermined. An eel's fin ran out its back, and there seemed to be an arm stretching out from under it. It all gave the impression of a person lying face down under a white glazed blanket. German and Lawrence came into view, approaching it. It was Luna's approaching step that would tear her from the sight and back at Caelid, still somberly on the rock. Closer, she could see the works she had made on the pages. The pen lingered at the tip of what appeared similarly in design to her staple runes. Herself displayed no sign of acknowledgement that someone was near. Her eyes were shut and red from tears still. Her mouth moved very slowly, mouthing sounds inaudible. Caelid, Maria uttered gently, like a whisper. She opened her eyes and questioningly turned her head towards her and Luna. Her eyes carried an uncanny maturity, along with the streaks yet visible from heavy tears. She was the visage of pure sorrow, yet displayed a sense of peace. She turned her head back towards the bottomless sea and closed the book. Let's be off then. Her voice shook something fierce. Maria took her hand and moved back towards the cave. But her eyes were drawn towards where Lawrence and German stood at a bloated carcass. They had walked around it, and Lawrence now sat knelt down, with only the top of his head perceived over the body, while German was turned slightly away from him. "Luna!" Lawrence called out for her with a hint of excitement. She reluctantly left their side to join his. As she did, Caelid's grip of her hand tightened, and she drew a quick, quivering breath. Luna immediately found what Lawrence thought so interesting, and wide-eyed threw herself down beside her colleague, something that by German's expression would appear more revolting than curious. When Maria as well began to move closer, Caelid started pulling backwards like a frightened dog on a leash. "Just leave it alone. It's not worth it," Please, just leave it alone. Maria turned to look at her, and Carrie let go, remaining in her place as Maria advanced forward. Being where she was, it appeared more like a mermaid from the stories, albeit not quite in the likeness of how she had pictured the fair maidens of the sea. Estimately, it could be well above 40 feet, considering it laying out flat. The body lay on its stomach with spiky growths along its backbone, now laying limp. The upper body of a person, about 12 feet of its overall length, lay with its arms outstretched, but with a much longer neck, akin to an eel, with small narrow tendrils at the end. Lawrence had lifted up a large piece of skin, or membrane, that lay outstretched on the sand. He had begun examining the creature. It did indeed appear quite curious.
It looks exactly like a human, but...
He sat in awe. So did Luna. German peered away at times, not overtly curious.
Maria, look.
It was as if he had forgotten the previous events, which did not sit entirely well with her, but the sight was one to behold. Beneath the loose tissue resembling large fins, there was indeed what appeared as a woman's body, although merged grossly with a fish. What was so captivating was how the light seemed to catch the sheening surface, but to her surprise, once examining closer, the skin had the occasional slug-like insect moving slowly over it. Incredibly tiny and nearly indistinguishable, were it not for the faint glow they emanated.
Lawrence, could it be?
Luna reached out a quivering hand towards a bulbous growth that, with a human anatomy in mind, would most certainly be its belly.
My God, it's dead. But could it truly?
The two looked at each other, deciding on something the rest was not privy to.
What is this?
She was terribly frightened for the anticipated answer.
Possibly what we truly came here for.
He began to search his pack and retrieved his set of dissecting tools. Being both exhausted and now irritated, she nearly became enraged with him.
Haven't we done enough here?
No, I won't leave here until I have something of the truth. His reply was cold and filled with suppressed anger, but not directed towards her, she could tell.
But it is dead. I mean, what do we know? And...
Maria, please, just... He began, despite her protest.
The fetus. Perhaps it is alive. Then... we are doing it a service.
He looked feverish. German leaned in closer. Finally, his attention caught. What is? He pointed. Lawrence had barely cut deep before glowing dots poured out. He recoiled, but Luna was quick with a small vial. More of the small glowing insects began to lazily crawl out from the cut.
Oh, this is...
He resumed. Maria looked away. She was quickly forced to return her attention as a unified gasp emitted from Lawrence and Luna. It is with child.
Luna stammered. Lawrence still had his tools working inside the belly.
Lawrence, stop!
Maria yelled in frustration.
How can you do something like this? To butcher this unborn would be beyond me. And it should be beyond you too.
Lawrence trembled and his voice shook.
But he's right, Maria. There are eyes. I can see them. Here, on its umbilical cord. Eyes on the inside. Just like he said it would be.
But think of what you're doing. This price is too high.
Luna tried to say something to her, but she only opened her mouth and closed it when nothing came to mind. Lawrence looked to German. With only a glance, they exchanged their opinions, resulting in German turning his eyes to look at her. He visibly swallowed his previous disgust and stared into her eyes with extreme focus. Evolution without courage will be the ruin of our race. She turned right around, feeling sick from both the anger and the gore. Carrie looked at her coming her way, and tears started filling her eyes. She erupted in a weeping fit and rushed towards them, screaming at them to stop. Maria only kept on walking. The other protectors moved out of her way without looking up at her. When she reached the hamlet center where it all transpired, she stopped. There had never been any thoughts as to where she was going, or if she went alone. She did not want to stay, but neither did she fully want to return to Bergenworth. German's distinguishable footsteps came closer behind her. Much of her temper had now run off her, replaced only with despair.
Damn him. Why did he not do this himself? Why did we have to?
German stood by her side.
Evolution,
she said mockingly.
What could possibly be of such worth?
She turned to him. He had no answer to give. His silent and sympathetic demeanor finally brought forth the tears in her eyes.
Why must he be so damn curious?
She screamed at him whilst he moved in to catch her in her outbreak. She dug deep into his shoulder and tried to cry as much and as silently as she could. I'm sorry, Maria. I never foresaw us. I never thought I could do it. Had I known what truly awaited us, I never would have taken you here. She released herself from his embrace, and by reflex laid her hand at her side to her Rakuyo. Her faithful, blood-drenched Rakuyo. Her hand recoiled from it, like it was pulled directly from the forge, at the thought of what it had helped her accomplish. She gazed at her own hand, bandaged and blooded from the blood she willingly gave. Horrible blood serving an evil purpose, just like her ancestors. She suspected now that she would never be able to lay her hand on it again. Nothing would ever be the same. She removed it from the straps and walked towards the well. There was no hesitation. This was not for her anymore, this life. She had to atone one way or another. With a final look back to German, she tossed her long compatriot into the dark depths. German reacted little, only with a beaten sigh and slight nod. Nothing would be the same. Bergenworth, Bergenworth, blasphemous murderers, blood-crazed fiends, atonement for the wretches by the wrath of Mother Cos, mercy for the poor wizened child, mercy, oh please, atonement for the wretches. Lay the curse of blood upon them, and their children, and their children's children forevermore. Each wretched birth will plunge each child into a lifetime of misery. Mercy for the poor wizened child. Let the pungence of Cos cling like a mother's devotion.
Rakuyo. Hunter weapon wielded by Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower. A trick sword originated in the same country as the Canehurst Chikage. Only this sword feeds not of blood, but instead demands great dexterity. Lady Maria was fond of this aspect of the Rakuyo, as she frowned upon blood blades, despite being a distant relative of the queen. One day, she abandoned her beloved Rakuyo, casting it into a dark well when she could stomach it no longer.